As we are getting into the first book of Samuel, I've already read the first few chapters. I wanted to talk a little bit about the book of Samuel. Matter of fact, I want to talk about both the books of Samuel, First and Second Samuel. So, first of all, just a couple of things, a couple of historical notes on these books. The first thing is that in the original Hebrew Bible, or the oldest versions we can find, and what is currently used by the Jews, First and Second Samuel are listed as one book. They are not divided. This division originally was done in the Greek Septuagint. And the Greek Septuagint is what the Latin Vulgate was based on, and the King James Bible is based on the Latin Vulgate. So in the King James, we have this division of 1st and 2nd Samuel. But as I say, in the Hebrew Bible, it's just the book of Samuel. In addition, it's very odd. I find it to be very oddly titled because Samuel appears only in about the first half of the first book. It doesn't appear at all in the second book, not even really mentioned. So why is it called the book of Samuel? But I'll talk about that again in just a moment. I want to talk a little bit about the author of this book. Because in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29, it says that all the acts of David are recorded in the book of Samuel the seer, Nathan the seer, and Gad the seer. Now, some might think that this reference to the book of Samuel the seer is what we have as the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is not the case. The 1st and 2nd Samuel were not written by Samuel. They're histories. The book of Samuel the seer would have been a book that he wrote containing mainly his prophecies. Just like we have with Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is mainly prophecy. It has some historical notes in it to kind of set up some of the prophecies, but it's primarily a book of prophecy. And the book of Samuel the seer would have been the same, would have been a book of prophecy. And you would have seen indications of his writing. He would have introduced himself like Isaiah does. He would have explained who he was. He would speak in the first person. We don't get any of that in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So these were histories that were compiled later on, and most likely used some of the information found in the books of Samuel the seer, Nathan the seer, and Gad the seer. And actually, I believe in chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, it talks about Samuel writing a book. And then you have reference to the book of Jasher as well, which I have referenced in the past with in Genesis and all that. I've talked about some of the stuff in what we have today as the book of Jasher, which I don't think is exactly the same as what they had back then. These are all different books that we know existed and likely contributed to the knowledge that the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel used to write his histories. Now, it is assumed that the author of Samuel, who we have no clue who it was, there's no indication anywhere of who wrote these books, but it is understood that he was a prophet. These are prophetic histories. Much like the Book of Mormon, written by Mormon, who was a prophet. He compiled the Book of Mormon through prophecy, through revelation. The man who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel would have been the same. He would have been a prophet historian. But why is it called the Book of Samuel? If Samuel is only in the first quarter, he's in the first half of the first book of Samuel and doesn't appear at all in the second book of Samuel. Now, when we understand, as I said, this was originally one book. In the Hebrew Bible, it is still one book. And some people just say, well, it starts with the birth of Samuel, so it's called the Book of Samuel. But I don't think that's exactly accurate. I mean, that is partly true. It does start with Samuel. So it might be that you call it Samuel. But I think it is the Book of Samuel, or the 1st and 2nd Samuel, are the story of the two kings of Israel that were anointed king by Samuel. So even though he doesn't appear in 2 Samuel, it is still the story of the king that he anointed to be king. And I think that's the connection. To me, that's the connection. Is that this story takes you from the birth of Samuel to the death of David, about 130 years, as it states in the Bible dictionary, about a 130-year period, starting with the birth of Samuel to the death of the last king that was anointed by Samuel. In other words, it is going from when Samuel was born until the end of his direct influence in Israel. At the death of David, that's when we get into a time period where none of these people knew Samuel. None of these people had been anointed by Samuel. They had not been blessed by Samuel. And so now we're getting into a period that is no longer directly influenced by Samuel. Finally, I want to just kind of do a brief overview of what these books contain. These books can be divided into 6 basic time periods, each book having 3 time periods. So 1 Samuel is split into 3. First, we have the prologue. This is what I call the prologue. Because remember, these books are the story of the 2 kings that Samuel anointed to be king. So the prologue is Samuel's life before he anoints Saul, chapters 1 through 8. Not a lot of detail on him, enough that we understand why he is the one anointing Saul, why Saul is being anointed and all that. All that's kind of explained. Then we get the reign of Saul, the early reign of Saul when he was a righteous king, and that gives us 9 through 15. And that ends with Saul's fall from grace. And starting in chapter 16, we have David is anointed king, and we have the rivalry between David and Saul starts in chapter 16 and continues to the end with the death of Saul. Then in the second book of Samuel, we have the reign of David as king. This begins with a kind of civil war period, a period of turbulence where David is consolidating his power. And this is chapter 1 through 7. And this takes us through this time where the house of Saul is still trying to maintain their rulership and David is becoming king and they're consolidating. They take Jerusalem and establish it as the capital. Then we have the middle period of his reign. At this time, he is now the king of all Israel. And we have this kind of middle period where he's the king of all Israel. We get his affair with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. And this kind of middle point of we see the fall of David, how he falls from grace. And then we see in the third part primarily a civil war between David and his sons. I believe it's like 2 different sons of his that try and usurp the throne in some way. There's a lot of conflict with his children. His whole family kind of falls apart a bit. And we get this later period of just turbulence in his life. And so we get this consolidation, the high period, and then the collapse at the end. These 3 kind of areas. But that's kind of the overview, how the book is kind of structured. We get these periods in here. But as I said, I just wanted to go over what the books of Samuel contain and how they're structured and kind of the history of them as much as we understand it. So I will now continue with reading in Samuel. We'll be picking up in chapter 4. So we will continue in the prologue.